Hello, everyone. I thought I would give a mini lecture on the Victorian novel. Now, of course, before I talk about the Victorian novel, I have to talk about the history of the novel in general. Now, you might be surprised to learn that the novel actually isn't as old as a lot of people think. I thought the novel, at least in English, was around 1,000 years old, at least, going back to Middle English and possibly even Old English. But, of course, it depends on how you define a novel. But the novel as we know it today, at least in English, is only around 300 years old. Um, the first novel that people think was actually a novel was Robinson Crusoe, which was written in 1719. Now, of course, throughout the 1700s, the novel was very sparse, mainly because a lot of people were illiterate then. So, although the novel flourished somewhat in the 1700s, it didn't really come into its own until the middle of the 1800s. Now, of course, there are some pretty famous novels from the late 1700s, such as Jane Austen wrote a lot of her novels in the late 1700s. And then, of course, you have a lot of the Gothic stories and tales go back to the 1700s. And but again, the novel didn't quite come into its own until the 1800s. Before that, poetry was really all the rage. Narrative poems, short poems, but they didn't really have a firm narrative structure. A lot of these poems. Um, but poetry was all the rage in the 1700s. But however, by the Victorian period, by the 1830s, 1840s, the novel really started to come into its own. And of course, one man who was largely responsible for that was Charles Dickens, who wrote stories like Oliver Twist, David Copperfield, and then later in his career he wrote, of course, one of my favorite books, The Great Expectations. Now, this edition is not from the 19th century. I believe it is from the 1940s. I believe it's been in my family a long time. I don't know who originally had it, but the novel flourished during this time period, and I think it was because of the industrialization, people had more leisure time. Literacy rates went up, and that allowed people to read more, to enjoy free time more, and again, because of that, the novel flourished in a very significant way. And also, one of the major things about the Victorian novel is that it really isn't. It really came out of poetry when it came to coming into its own, because the Victorian novel was very poetic. It had a very poetic fervor, a very poetic resonance to it, and obviously that was because of poetry. But the difference is that the Victorian novel had a lot of narrative power that regular poetry simply did not have. And so, one of the things you will see throughout the Victorian novel is, of course, immense descriptive power, but you will also see poetic devices. And also, one of the major things you will see is that elements of nature will often reflect the emotions of the characters. So, for example, if a character is feeling melancholy, then it might be storming outside. Or if a character is feeling happy, then the sun might be glistening or shining. Um, there are a lot of examples of nature reflecting the emotions of the characters, and of course you will see that throughout Dickens' work and many other Victorian novels. Now, of course, I also would like to touch on America as well, because in America during the 19th century, you had people like Edgar Allan Poe and Herman Melville, who were, of course, Edgar Allan Poe never wrote one novel, but what I'm saying applies to literature in general, not just novels. But I would say, I guess, one of the differences between the American 19th century novel or writing and the English is that the American 19th century novel had a greater sense of free spirit, a greater sense of adventure, a greater sense of energy. You will definitely see that in Herman Melville's work about exploration, and of course this goes back to the idea that the Americans had just won their independence from England, and therefore there was a great sense of wanting to break away from the old traditions. And now another thing that is unique, very unique about the Victorian novel is that it was serialized. That it would be it was you would have to wait week to week in order to find out what happened. And this is very unique to the Victorian novel, especially because novels actually were very expensive. A lot of people couldn't afford them, so they would purchase magazines, and then they would have read 20, 30 pages, and then they would have to wait the next month to find out what happened in the next installment. And Dickens released all of his books that way, which of course is why people were reading his last book, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, when he died, and therefore they were left in suspense because they would never find out what happened because he died. But these serializations were immensely popular, and because of that, people became emotionally attached to the authors in a way that they really hadn't been before. So so Dickens, for example, would go on these large lecture tours, lecturing and reading to audience members. And I guess again, you have to realize that people didn't have television at this time, or really any kind of home entertainment. If people wanted any kind of home entertainment, that they would have to go out to the theater or anything else. But back then there were only two ways of getting narrative stories. One way was, of course, to talk to your grandfather and see what kind of stories he had to tell you. And the other way would be to read a book. So if you wanted any kind, so people were so that was the kind of home entertainment people had. But if people wanted any other kind of entertainment, they would have to leave their house and go to these and see theater or these lecture tours, and they were immensely popular. And that's why Dickens was like a rock star almost during his lifetime. He enjoyed probably more fame during his lifetime than anyone else, because because he became somewhat of a legendary figure, and he also became somewhat of a moral figure as well. Now, what led to the end of the Victorian novel? Well, there are several things. The main thing I believe, I mean, of course, the Victorian era ended, but what led to the end of that kind of writing style? Well, I think it largely had to do with radio and, of course, later television, because once people started getting these other entertainment venues that were visual in nature, then people no longer really, novelists especially and writers, no longer felt that they needed to be as visual because people were getting these things in other places. So because of that, people started developing more of a bare bones approach to writing, a more practical and utilitarian approach that wasn't quite as descriptive or poetic, and which ultimately, I think, one of the things that distinguishes the 19th century novel and the Victorian novel from the novels that came after, is that poetic fervor, and is that descriptive technique. It's the fact that the 19th century novels were very descriptive, and then once you got into the 20th century, people started experimenting more with style in terms of stream of consciousness. So a lot of 20th century books, and not all of them, of course, weren't as concerned with aesthetic merit. They were concerned more with experimenting with the medium. And so, for example, people adopted stream of consciousness writing styles where instead of a narrator being linear and coherent, it was all about thinking like you are an actual person. So that the consciousness is very split up and very fragmented, and so that writing style became very popular in the 20th century among people like James Joyce, or even someone like William Faulkner, who I think probably used it the best because he was able to combine stream of consciousness with more traditional poetic techniques. But overall, I would say that was the end of the Victorian novel. But of course, the Victorian novel, or the 19th century novel, is my favorite kind of literature, because I just enjoy the immense aesthetic beauty and poetic power of the 19th century novel. So I hope you enjoyed this little mini lecture.